In the damp gray twilight of late December 2006, a quiet electronic wire transfer left the British Treasury in London. The payment was for $83 million. It marked the exact moment Great Britain finally closed out its debt to the United States for the supplies that ensured its survival in the Second World War. For more than half a century, the public narrative of the 20th century has been told as a grand romantic alliance. We are told of the close fraternal friendship between Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, standing shoulder to defeat fascism. Yet beneath the soaring wartime rhetoric of brotherhood and shared democratic destiny lay a calculating, cold-blooded geopolitical transaction. Churchill watched his nation's centuries-old wealth drain across the Atlantic as the price of American support. The United States systematically bought the British Empire through a series of ruthless diplomatic ultimatums, classified asset liquidations, and sovereign debt traps. Washington dismantled 1,000 years of British history, not with battleships, but with the cold leverage of a creditor. This is the history of how Washington used the leverage of bankruptcy to foreclose on the British Empire and permanently relocate the center of global power to the United States. In September 1939, the British Empire still appeared to be the most formidable global entity on Earth. It governed a quarter of the world's population, commanded the Royal Navy, and the City of London remained a primary clearinghouse of international trade. This ledger visualizes the catastrophic financial arithmetic hiding beneath that imperial facade. In 1938, the governor of the Bank of England delivered a classified assessment to the cabinet. Britain's gold and dollar reserves stood at barely £500 million. Norman warned that in the event of a major war with Germany, the British Empire would exhaust its entire liquid financial reserves within 18 months, leaving the nation entirely dependent on the financial mercy of the United States. Borrowing was not an option. During the Great Depression, the British government had defaulted on its massive First World War debt to Washington. Congress retaliated with the Johnson Act, which strictly prohibited any defaulting foreign government from obtaining commercial loans in American markets. When war erupted, Britain was legally barred from borrowing a single dollar on Wall Street. Bound by the Neutrality Acts, President Roosevelt could only sell war supplies under the uncompromising statute of cash and carry. Every single airplane, bullet, and bushel of wheat had to be paid for, 100% up front, in physical gold bullion or US dollars. Because American credit was legally shut off, the only way for the British Empire to fund its survival was to physically cannibalize its own wealth. To keep its population from starvation and its armies fighting, the British government began the systematic liquidation of its sovereign reserves. By summer of 1940, the British Expeditionary Force had been driven off the beaches of Dunkirk, abandoning thousands of vehicles and artillery pieces in the sand. Great Britain stood completely alone, requiring billions of dollars in American supplies to avoid immediate collapse. To pay the astronomical procurement taps, the British government launched Operation Fish. Under total blackout conditions, bank workers packed hundreds of tons of sovereign gold bullion and private corporate securities into heavy wooden crates. Warships carried the gold across the North Atlantic through U-boat sectors to secure vaults in Montreal. From Canada, the physical gold was transported across the American border and deposited directly into the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the United States Treasury Depository at Fort Knox to settle the accounts of the British Purchasing Commission. Between 1939 and late 1940, Britain shipped more than $2 billion in physical gold to the United States. In barely a year of combat, the United States absorbed virtually the entire sovereign gold reserve accumulated by the British Empire over 2 centuries. The gold alone was not enough. In September 1940, the United States agreed to transfer 50 obsolete First World War-era destroyers to the Royal Navy. In exchange, Great Britain granted the United States 99-year rent-free sovereign military leases on 8 vital naval and air bases spanning from Newfoundland to British Guyana. Without firing a single shot, the United States pushed its military perimeter thousands of miles out into the Atlantic Ocean. The deal permanently ejected the Royal Navy from its historic dominance over the Western Hemisphere. In September 1940, the British government was forced into another profound concession, the Tizard Mission. A delegation of scientists arrived in Washington to hand over the engineering blueprints for the operational jet engine and classified research proving that a critical mass of uranium could create an atomic explosion. This is a cavity magnetron. It generated a 100-fold increase in radar power over existing American research, making the technology small enough to mount inside aircraft. American corporate contractors took these blueprints, mass-produced the technology, and retained the permanent commercial patents and post-war manufacturing rights. By trading away its strategic bases and breakthrough science for immediate survival, Britain permanently surrendered its geographical and technological edge to the rising American superpower. By November 1940, the mathematical breaking point arrived. Britain's liquid dollar reserves fell below $50 million. Winston Churchill drafted a desperate letter to President Roosevelt, admitting that cash resources were completely exhausted, and the war effort was on the verge of grinding to a halt. Roosevelt introduced the Lend-Lease bill to Congress to provide supplies on credit, but Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. demanded that the British government carry out a public humiliating liquidation of its prized commercial assets in America before Congress would vote on the aid. This chart shows the financial execution of the American Viscose Corporation, the crown jewel of British corporate investment in America. The British government seized it and forced its sale to a Wall Street syndicate for $54 million, less than half its true market value. The Wall Street banking syndicate immediately turned around and sold the shares to the American public for $62 million, pocketing millions in quick profits, while British corporate executives wept in London boardrooms as their industrial empire was liquidated for scrap. Lend-Lease functioned as an imperial mortgage, requiring the total extraction of British wealth before Washington would open the tap of American aid. The United States would extract every last drop of realizable assets before the first shipment reached British shores. When Washington provided Lend-Lease, it attached Article 7 to the agreement. This clause forced Churchill to legally agree to dismantle the imperial preference system, guaranteeing that post-war, the captive markets of the British Empire would be thrown wide open to the overwhelming competition of American corporations. In July 1944, as Allied armies were liberating Western Europe, the financial architects of the post-war world gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods to finalize the monetary terms of the British Empire's surrender. Representing Great Britain was John Maynard Keynes. Frail and suffering from severe heart disease, Keynes fought for a synthetic global currency designed to protect debtor nations. His plan was a desperate attempt to preserve the financial autonomy of a dying empire. Representing the United States was Harry Dexter White. White used America's absolute monopoly on post-war industrial machinery and gold to crush Keynes' proposals, establishing an absolute monetary primacy over global trade. This flowchart outlines the terms dictated by the Americans. The United States dollar was crowned as the sole anchor and premier reserve currency, pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other currency, including the once mighty British pound, was forced to peg its exchange rate directly to the dollar. The financial throne that had resided in the city of London for 2 centuries was officially permanently relocated to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the United States Treasury. Just 4 days after the war ended, President Truman abruptly announced the immediate cancellation of the entire Lend-Lease program. Without warning, the daily pipeline of American food and oil was cut off. Keynes warned Washington that Britain was facing a financial Dunkirk, but the United States refused to provide a non-repayable grant. Washington provided an emergency loan of $3.75 billion, but attached a lethal, non-negotiable condition. Within 1 year, Great Britain had to make the pound sterling fully convertible into United States dollars for all international transactions. On July 15, 1947, Britain restored convertibility. The result was an immediate, catastrophic economic panic. Within 5 weeks, the Bank of England lost more than $1 billion of its reserves as the global economy voted with its capital against the British pound. The emergency American loan was incinerated in weeks. Facing sovereign insolvency, the British cabinet voted to suspend convertibility in a state of total public humiliation, trapping the nation in an inescapable web of dollar dependency. The final confirmation that Great Britain had ceased to be an independent world power arrived in 1956. When Britain invaded Egypt to seize the Suez Canal, President Dwight D. Eisenhower deployed the ultimate financial weapon rather than military. Treasury Secretary George Humphrey informed London that the United States would dump its holdings of British sterling bonds unless forces withdrew immediately. Facing total currency collapse within 48 hours, Anthony Eden accepted an unconditional surrender and resigned from office in disgrace. Bankrupt and unable to finance the military garrisons needed to police its global territories, Britain withdrew from India, Africa, and its naval bases east of Suez. The United States Navy quietly sailed in to fill the vacuum, establishing American military and economic supremacy over the world's primary maritime choke points. Empires fall when their balance sheets collapse and their gold drains into the vaults of a rising rival. The United States Treasury dismantled the British Empire, one transaction at a time, proving that global supremacy is ultimately decided on a spreadsheet.